Okay, awesome. All right. Can everyone hear me just fine?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Hi, everyone. I will be your teacher for today, Team Ruler 15, and today we are going to cover the difference between that and which in the conjunctions that and which in the English language. Okay, so before we start, can anyone tell me what a conjunction is? Yes, actually, yes, yeah, that's right. So a conjunction in English is a word or uh, a word or even two words that connect two two words, phrases, or clauses. So, for example, let me type in the classes chat channel. I went to the store and I got some milk. So we have this sentence. So the conjunction here would be and, because it's joining two clauses. I went to the store, that's one clause. I got some milk, that's the other clause. So that is what a conjunction is. So what we're going to talk about are two particular conjunctions, and they are actually a subset. See, they're what we call relative pronouns, which are a type of subordinate conjunction. But before we get into that, does anybody remember what a subordinating conjunction is? Yes, very good. That's exactly what it is. And someone wanted me to type something there. Okay. So yeah, that's correct. So subordinating conjunction.
Does that mean that the subordinating conjunction comes as additional information can be dropped?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Does it mean that subordinating conjunction comes as additional information can be dropped?
No. I know what you're asking about, but no, we're not. That's not really what I'm talking about right now. That's a separate concept. What you're referring to are non-restrictive clauses, and that's a different concept. Yeah. No, it's okay. So, but that is actually important. I'll go over that later though, because that will help you determine which pronoun to use regarding that and which. Yes. Okay. So as someone else said, a subordinating conjunction connects a dependent clause with an independent clause, and it goes at the head of the dependent clause. So let me write an example here. I failed the test because I didn't study. Let's use that example. Uh, so here, the conjunction, actually, let me type this and then type okay, so that's the example. So the conjunction, the subordinating conjunction here would be, I can't spell today. Okay, subordinating is, in this case, it is because. And here we have two clauses. I failed the test and because I didn't study. And because is at the head of the second clause, so it's a dependent clause. But before we talk about clauses, I should probably review them. Does anyone know what a clause is? close. It's more of it's clear close, but it's no, that would be just a conjunction in general, but well, certain conjunctions anyway. Um, a a clause is a part of a it's a unit of a sentence, but it may not necessarily be a sentence. It's a unit that has a subject and a predicate. So if you recall, the subject of the sentence is what the sentence is about. So in this example, the cat ran up the tree. In this example, the subject is the cat, right? But the predicate is what comes after the subject. So it can be a verb, or it can be a verb with other words, or a verb with prepositional phrases. In this case, we have ran up the tree as a predicate because there's a verb and there's a prepositional phrase after the verb. So this predicate is basically everything after the subject. And when you have these two things together, you have a clause. So regarding clauses, there are two types: independent clauses and dependent clauses. Those are two types. Independent clauses are complete thoughts. They can stand on their own. So, for example, we watched a movie. This is a complete thought. And so because it's a complete thought, it's an independent clause. It can stand on its own. That's why it's called independent. Now, a dependent clause is similar in a way because it has a subject and a predicate too, but it can't stand on its own. So, for example, after lightning struck. This is not a complete thought. It's a clause because it has a subject and a predicate, but it's not a complete thought because it can't stand on its own. So it's a dependent clause. It needs something else in order to function, which in this case would be an independent clause. So independent clauses can be by themselves, dependent clauses cannot be. And let me edit this a bit so that it's more obvious. And that would be, okay. So that's basically what a clause is. So now that you know about those, we should talk about, hold on, let me look at, I had an outline here. Okay, right. So, okay, so now that we've talked about clauses, let's talk about that and which. That and which are two special, subordinating conjunctions. So let me type them here. To be more specific, they're actually relative pronouns. Relative pronouns, let me type them down. Relative pronouns are a subset of subordinating conjunctions. So they work similarly to other subordinating conjunctions, but the thing is that they're pronouns. So that's what makes them special subordinating conjunctions. But I'm not going to talk about all the relative pronouns, just that and which. So that and which are used to they're used to form what we call restrictive and non-restrictive clauses. So let me type this down. Restrictive clauses versus non-restrictive clauses. Does anyone know what the difference is between a restrictive clause and a non-restrictive clause? Okay, that's okay. That's all right. So a restrictive clause is a clause that is, and someone mentioned this this concept earlier. A restrictive clause is a clause that is essential to the meaning of the sentence. So what does that mean? Well, let me give you an example. I'm trying to, let's go to the library that is next to the post office. Yeah, let's use that example. Okay. So here we have a complex sentence, which is of course a dependent clause and an independent clause put together. So here the independent clause is let's go to the library, and the dependent clause is that is next to the post office. This second part right here, that is next to the post office, is a restrictive clause because it is essential to the meaning of the sentence. It restricts what we're talking about. And I know this because if you take this part out, you would just have let's go to the library. But now you've changed the meaning of the sentence. We don't know what library you're talking about. You could be talking about any library. So that's why we call these restrictive clauses, because they limit what you're talking about. And there are other names. Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, yes. Yeah, that's exactly it. And these restrictive clauses have other names. You may know them as essential clauses or defining clauses. It really doesn't matter what name you use. And for non-restrictive, you may also know them as non-essential clauses and non-defining clauses. So those are other names for those, but they're really all the same thing. So, okay, just making sure this is working. Okay, so what about a non-restrictive clause? So as I said, a non-restrictive clause is a clause that is not important to the meaning of the sentence. So if you take it out, the meaning of the sentence won't change. So let's provide an example. Now we have this sentence. The book, which I bought yesterday, is still on the table. So here we have two clauses. The book is still on the table, that's the first clause, and which I bought yesterday is the second clause. So here, which I bought yesterday is a non-restrictive clause because we can take it out and the meaning of the sentence wouldn't change, like this. And what the heck? Okay, there we go. The book is still on the table. Okay, the sentence didn't change at all because we're still talking about the same book. We know what book you're talking about. So this which I bought yesterday isn't important to the meaning of the sentence. It's just extra information, so we can take it out. That's why it's non-restrictive or non-essential. If you remove the commas, does it change anything? Someone asked this in the chat. Yes, that's actually an important thing that I was just about to get into. So let's go back to that and which. So the conjunction that, let me type this out for you guys. The conjunction that is used for only restrictive clauses. Oh, yeah, that's right. Used only for restrictive clauses. Let me say that. Used only for restrictive clauses. Whereas the conjunction which, it can be used for both. Okay, so the conjunction that is used only for restrictive clauses, but the conjunction which can be used for both restrictive and non-restrictive clauses. So, and I know that this might be a bit different from what people were taught because I've seen sources that say that you should use that for restrictive and which for non-restrictive, but you can technically use which for restrictive. But see, the thing about which is that even though you can use it for restrictive clauses, it's not conventional to do so, at least in American English, because a lot of people don't really like doing that, but it's not wrong. So let me type this. Which is, what was I about to type? So which, okay, some people don't like using which for restrictive clauses. But that's, I guess, stylistic thing. That's just a choice. You can use which for restrictive clauses. So, as I said, some people don't like using which for restrictive clauses, but you technically can. Now, going back to what someone asked earlier, commas actually do, if you're going to use which for both restrictive and non-restrictive clauses, you need to be careful with how you use commas. So, first of all, I should point out that commas are used to set off non-restrictive clauses. Always, always. Commas are always used to set off non-restrictive clauses. So let me go ahead and type that here. Commas are always used for non-restrictive clauses. So, but for restrictive clauses, they're not used. And I know that this is confusing for some people because in languages like, say, German, you use commas to set off all subordinate clauses. But in English, it depends on how important the clause is to the meaning of the sentence. So you don't always have to set off clauses, subordinate clauses with commas. So that's one thing to keep in mind. So to go back to what someone was asking earlier, let's take that same example. So let me retype the example I used earlier. Let's do this one. The book, which I bought yesterday, is still on the table. That was our first sentence. Now let's take out the commas here. And remember, as I said, you can use which for restrictive clauses. So this is a technically fine sentence that I just typed right here. But can anyone tell me the difference between the second sentence and the first? The what? No, it's not a run-on sentence because you can replace the which with that in the second sentence and it would be fine. The commas mean what? Yes, but what's the difference in meaning between these two now that I've taken out the commas? Mm-hmm. So if there's no non-restrictive clause in the second sentence, what does that mean? What is this? Not quite. It's more that, so I took out the commas here and it actually did change the meaning of the sentence because now you're saying that there's a book. Okay, so how do I explain this? Okay, so here I took out the commas to show that you can use which in restrictive clauses. So as I said, restrictive clauses limit what you're talking about. So here, the second sentence implies that you have a set of books, or that there's more than one book, and that out of one of those books, you bought one yesterday. So it's restricting what we're talking about in the sentence. You're implying that in the second sentence, there's more than one book in the area, and you want to specify that you're talking about the book that you bought yesterday, compared to the first sentence where that you bought the book yesterday doesn't actually matter. It's just extra information. And if you go back and read these sentences, you'll see that they read a bit differently. So listen to how I read the first sentence and how I read the second sentence. The book, which I bought yesterday, is still on the table. The book which I bought yesterday is still on the table. So do you see how I read those two? Do you notice the difference? Yeah, in the second sentence, there's no pause. That's right. Which would imply, yeah, because see, yeah, because if you set these clauses off with commas, you're implying that whatever is in between the commas isn't actually important to the sentence, so you can just take it out. Yeah. Uh-huh. And let me provide another example. This part might be clearer. Okay. So here we have, and let me separate this a bit. Okay. So here we have two more sentences. And this time I switched the order of them. So now we have a sentence with a restrictive clause followed by a sentence with a non-restrictive clause. And the two are nearly the same, but the only difference is the commas. So again, listen to how I read these two sentences. So let's start with the first sentence. The ball which sound the hill began to roll. The ball which sound the hill began to roll. So notice the difference there again? Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. That's exactly it. You got it. Because in the first sentence, it implies that there's more than one ball, and you want to specify that you're talking about a ball that sat on the hill. But in the second sentence, that the ball sat on the hill is just extra information. It doesn't actually change anything. So we're only talking about one ball. Yes? A particle? Oh, article. Oh, with no, with article, you don't with that in which you don't have to worry about articles. They're fine by themselves, if that's what you're asking. The first, yeah, it has a restrictive clause, so it's being specific. You can, but the article before ball, like you could say a ball or the ball, um, that really doesn't that you could combine that with either restrictive or non-restrictive clause. So you could replace the in this in both of these sentences with a. So that really has no relation to whether or not you should use a restrictive or non-restrictive clause. Um, so okay. So going back to this example, as someone else pointed out, like the first one implies a set of balls, the second one does not. So and we know this because in the first sentence you could replace. Let me do that here. Oh yeah, I am American. Yeah, you're right. um, so let's go ahead and replace this with that. And let me boldface it. So you could replace the which in the first sentence with that, and it would still make sense. Because again, which can be restrictive or non-restrictive. So you could replace a restrictive which with that, and it would still mean the same thing. But with the second sentence, you can't do that. And let me show you. And I put a strike through there. Don't ever put that with commas. We never use that with commas. So just so you all know, that is never to be preceded by commas, ever. With which, it depends. It depends on whether or not you want to use it restrictively or non-restrictively. But, and let me type this, the conjunction that is never preceded by commas, ever. So don't ever put a comma before that in your sentences, ever. Okay, so that being said, if it's confused, I know for some people it's going to be confusing understanding the difference between that and which, because only which can be used for non-restrictive clauses. So what I recommend is I would recommend using that for restrictive clauses and which for non-restrictive clauses. That way, you're like, okay, with that I don't have to worry about commas, but with which I'll just put a comma whenever I see a which. So instead of just sticking with just which for both. So if you're a learner, I recommend just using, here, let me type this. For learners, I recommend using that, let me say using only that for restrictive clauses. At least until you feel more comfortable knowing the difference between the two. Then you can use which if you want for restrictive clauses. But for now, I recommend using only that. So that way you don't get confused on, where to put commas in the sentence or whether or not you should put one, to be more precise. So because again, in English, that clauses are never surrounded by commas, ever. But which clauses can be? It depends. Okay, and let me check my outline. Okay. Um, so does anyone have any questions so far? Okay. Oh, okay. So, mm-hmm. Oh, okay. Okay. So let me provide another example. Actually, let me provide an example. This time, let me do this. So let me type a sentence in, say, German. So here, and I'll provide an English translation. So here we have, Sie wissen, dass ich habe eine Schwester, which in English translates to, they know that I have a sister. But in English, you cannot put commas before that. It's just, no. In German, you can, you have to, but in English, no, you do not. So you don't do it like that. So that clauses are never set off or surrounded by commas. So here we have a that clause, that is, that I have a sister. These are never to be surrounded by commas, ever. So it has to be like this. They know that I have a sister. So it has to be like that. So no commas. I mean, you can use parentheses to set off that clauses. I think that would be fine, but don't use commas. Parentheses, I think those are fine, but commas, no. Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think that if you're using parentheses to set that off, then you're implying that it's non-restrictive. So I don't think that would be fine, but I'm not quite sure on that, to be honest. That is, yeah. Hmm. Um, it's see regarding see I that's how do I okay, so in informal writing, or rather informal or informal writing, people even in formal writing, people don't really use that with that clauses with commas. Like they would just omit the commas because the commas aren't required there. So um but I'm not sure about the point with parentheses though, because I don't use parentheses or brackets like that, so I wouldn't really know. But I will look into that though, because that is a good question. But I think that if you use parentheses, you're implying that the clause is non-restrictive, but I don't know. So I'm not completely sure on that. Um, okay, well, anyway, um, let's go ahead and, oh, go ahead. Oh, yes, that's, I forgot to mention that. That's actually a good point. You could take, yeah, you could take the that out of the sentence and it would be fine. I'll put it in brackets here to show that it's been omitted. So you could say this. I forgot to mention that because in English, you could omit certain relative pronouns from the sentence. So with that, that is one of them, of course. So you could say, they know I have a sister. And it would be grammatical. Like, you won't see it as much in formal writing, but I mean, either way, it's grammatical. So they know I have a sister. Yeah. So you could do that. And let's see. And regarding this, let's bring back the sentence that I had earlier. The book. Let me change the which to that. So the book that I bought yesterday. So we have a that here. I changed the which to that. The book that I bought yesterday is still on the table. We can omit that, well, the word that. So we could say the book I bought yesterday. So you could do that. Yeah, that's something I forgot to mention. So yeah, with that, you can omit it. But Keith, there's one thing I should point out though. That's only if the word that is not the subject of the clause, of the dependent clause. So if you had something like this, if you have a sentence like this, that is the dog that was injured. You can't omit the that here. because you'd have a sentence like this. This is not grammatical because that is functioning as the subject of the clause. Yeah, and it's a conjunction too. So in cases like that, you can't omit that. But in other cases, like the ones above, you can omit that. It would be fine. And yeah, especially in informal English, this can also happen in formal English, but it's more common in informal English. In informal English, you want to get into the habit of dropping the pronoun that, because including it all the time just sounds really weird. So more often than not, it's natural to just omit it. Though be careful with how you do it, because if you don't omit it carefully, your sentences might sound like run-on sentences. But more often than not, it's fine to omit the that in that sentence, especially after certain verbs such as think. Like I think he's here. Like after verbs like that, it's common to omit the pronoun that. Okay, so far, does anyone have any questions? No? Okay. Um, okay, so I think I've explained, now that I've explained the concepts of that and which, would anyone like to try to make an example where you use that or which correctly in a sentence? Okay, so I see someone, oh, two people are typing up something. Okay. Okay, so the first example someone posted is the girl, which I met yesterday, talked to me today. Okay, that's good. That was the correct use of which, because you're implying that that part, I met her yesterday, wasn't important to the sentence. The movie, which I watched yesterday, was really good. Okay, that's also a good use of which. Oh, no problem. No problem, Weltschmerz. I'm happy to help. The book that's on the table is mine. Okay, very good. That's a good use of that. And of course, you don't surround that clauses by commas. That would sound really awful. The teacher that is teaching us is great. Okay, that's good. No. No, you can't really use commas like that.
She simulated an essential bottom sentence from the sentence.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You really wouldn't put a comma there. But if you want to say, but your first one is fine. The second one, no, because the that implies that it's a restrictive clause, so you don't use commas like that. I'm sorry, what? You're, I'm sorry, I don't understand. Oh, oh, yeah, the classes chat. Yeah, we're in that channel. You're not? Oh, okay. Yeah. Go. I would like talk to one of the moderators and they see if they can do something about that. Okay. Okay, let's see. That which said that, thought that that was not that, was not that, which should be that. I see what you did there. He climbed the tree, which made him get injured. Um, okay, so that one. I'm not sure about it either. Because are you implying that the tree, are you talking about a certain tree that made him get injured, or are you just, is that his getting injured, is that just extra information? Because that I don't understand. So it could be, I mean that's not wrong, but if you mean to say that there are there's more than one tree, and you want to talk about a certain tree that made him get injured, then in that case it would be fine. And yeah, Clinton's right. You could also just say the movie I watched yesterday was boring. And let's see, the new app that I'm making is almost ready to be released. Uh, no, it doesn't. It could be non-restrictive, but in this case, the sentence you wrote is fine. You don't have to say the new app, which I'm making, it's almost ready to be released, unless that part isn't important. So it could be either one. But the sentence you wrote is fine. The dress, which I bought yesterday, is for my best friend. Yes, very good. Okay. Is which the literary form of that? Literary, I'm not sure that's the best way to describe it. I guess, I don't know. I honestly don't know the history of that, but it, see, I don't, in some, I think you're probably more likely to see which being used in a manner similar to that in literary text, but I'm not sure. I don't really know the whole history about it. But yeah, conventionally, people like using that for restrictive clauses because using which doesn't sound very nice to a lot of people, but it's not wrong. But if you are going to use which for restrictive clauses, you have to be careful because a single comma can change the meaning of a whole sentence. Let me just go ahead and, okay. One more thing I forgot to mention. Um, Regarding the pronoun dropping, with that, and in some cases which, if which is functioning as a restrictive, uh, in restrictive clauses, if it's in restrictive clauses, you could actually do this. You could drop that more than one time in a sentence. So you could say, so instead of saying, I think that this is the game that you wanted, we could just omit those two that's and have this sentence. So you could actually drop that more than once in a sentence. So you don't have to. It doesn't have to be just once, or you could actually just remove one of them and it'd be fine. So, but one thing I should point out here is that in the example I just wrote, the first that is functioning as a noun clause. The that clause, the first that clause is a noun clause, and the second that clause is an adjective clause. Because the adjective clause is describing the game. Which game? The game that you wanted. Whereas a noun clause is just the direct object of the verb think. What do you think? I think that this is the game. Well, and then there's another part after that. But that's just something I wanted to point out. But you can, but whether it's an adjective clause or a noun clause, you can omit that from the sentence, provided that you're using the noun and adjective clauses correctly. Mm-hmm. Yes, that's correct. Um, well, for a noun clause, it's more like it's just a clause that's functioning as a, well, a noun or any object, or like, for example, let me see. No, okay. So before I go continue, someone said, "Can't you say which one of you did this?" For instance. Okay, no, that's a different use of which. That's not, we're not talking about the interrogative which. We're talking about the subordinating which. Those are two different concepts. So this which doesn't belong here. And I know it's confusing for some people because, like, say in German, the interrogative which and the subordinating which are mapped separately. Like they're two different words. But in English, they're the same word, and you have to tell from the context which is which. But no, we're not talking about the which the which that you use for asking questions. We're talking about the which that you use for um, describing things. Okay, so what was I going to say? Oh, right, a noun clause. Yeah, that's just something to keep in mind, because I know that that can be slightly confusing for some people because you have two concepts that are mapped to the same word, but over time you can get a sense of what to use because the context will make it pretty clear which one is which. So let me. But thank you for bringing that up. Actually, that's actually a good point. So the interrogative which is not equal, and I put a not equal sign here, although it doesn't look like a not equal sign, not much like one anyway. The interrogative which does not equal the subordinating which. Those are two different concepts. So keep that in mind. Okay. But going back to what someone was asking, a noun clause is just a clause that functions as a noun. So I hate when he arrives late to meetings. So in this case, the when he arrives late to meetings, that's the noun clause. Yeah. Or you could say I hate it when he arrives late to meetings. It is kind of optional. It's optional here, but I mean, either way, it's just a noun clause. Um, um, I think that's really all I can say for this. So does anyone have any questions? Because I can't really think of anything else to talk about. Okay, go ahead. Oh, that's actually a good point. Thank you for bringing that up. Okay, so what was your sentence again? Okay. Yes, very good. Yeah, that's exactly it. So the first that and this the first that is a conjunction. The second one is what we call a demonstrative adjective. Like demonstrative pronouns are like that, yeah, this, that, these, those. they're pronouns when they're by themselves, and they're adjectives when they're in front of a noun. So if they're by themselves, we call them demonstrative pronouns. If they're combined with the noun, we call them demonstrative adjectives. So the second that is a demonstrative adjective. So that's something to keep in mind. But the first one is a conjunction. I know, again, it's confusing because, again, you have two concepts that are mapped to the same word. But here, the first that is not, you could omit the first that and you could say the same thing. Oh, you could, but that'd be kind of weird, to be honest. I think the first that would have to be there to prevent the sentence from sounding weird. This is one of those times where you shouldn't omit that from the sentence. I mean, you could, but it would sound weird. It would sound weird, and you might confuse people a bit. But that is a good point to bring up. So the first that and the second that here. Actually, let me type this out. The first that is a subordinating. I'll just call it. Yeah, let's call it that. Subordinating conjunction. The second that is a demonstrative adjective. So again, two different concepts. And another thing I should also mention, there are cases where remember how I said that which can be used for both restrictive and non-restrictive clauses? Well, there are times where, and you know how, there are times where only which should be used instead of that, because again, that is used only for restrictive clauses. So there are times, what I'm saying here is that there are times where you should use which instead of that to make the sentence sound better. So, oh, hold on. Okay, sorry. So what I was saying before is that there are times where if you want to use a restrictive that, you can't because it would sound bad. So for example, here let's say we have a sentence like this. Ooh, hold on. One thing I should point out. Okay, so let's do this and this. Okay, okay. So here I type two sentences. The first one is not grammatical, but the second one is. Now I know I said that only that can be used for restrictive clauses and how you could use which for both restrictive and non-restrictive clauses. So with restrictive clauses, you can use either that or which, but this is one of those times where only which is the correct form to use. So you can't say that you want does not exist. You have to say that which you want does not exist. So you can't put two that's together like that. In the other one, you can, but in this one, no. So that's something to keep in mind. This is the only time where you'd have to use which instead of that if you want to use a restrictive clause. And of course, you could change that to a non-restrictive clause, but you don't really need to because it's not wrong to do so, but you don't. I don't see a reason to. Oh, you have to go? Okay, well, you're welcome. Bye. And regarding that second sentence, you could also replace the that which, those two words with what. And then you'll see why it's different from the other example that someone brought up earlier. So you could say, instead of that which you want does not exist, you could say what you want does not exist. And now you can see why it's fine to use two that's together in the other example, but not in this example. Because of that which is basically just what. if that makes sense. So just keep in mind, when you have two that's together, just keep in mind how you use them. Because there are times where you can put them together and there are times where you can't. Okay, so that's just what I wanted to say about that. I think that's all I can say about this topic, though. I can't think of anything else. But does anyone have any questions? No? Okay. I'm sorry, what? Oh, that's a good question, actually. So someone is asking if you should use who or that, or technically which, to refer to a person. Really, you can use that to refer to people, but it's preferable to use who. I mean, I guess it really just depends on how important the person's identity is. I'm not quite sure, to be honest, but it's not wrong to use that for people, but people prefer to use who. So it's more of a preference than an actual grammatical mistake. Because I have heard people using that to refer to people, so it's not wrong to use that to refer to people, but it's preferable to use who. Just like how it's not wrong to use which for restrictive clauses, but it's preferable to use that in most cases. So I hope that answers your question. Okay, but I think that's really it for this class. Hopefully, but let me just say one thing. To summarize, that is used for only restrictive clauses, and which is used only for, actually, which can be used for either restrictive or non-restrictive clauses. And I recommend using that for restrictive clauses and which for non-restrictive clauses. So if you're going to use which for restrictive clauses, I don't recommend it, not because I don't like it. I don't like it, but that's not why. It's because it's not as conventional to do it's not as conventional to do that compared to using that. And plus, you might confuse yourself because if you put a comma before which, or if you take a comma out, then you might confuse yourself on what to use. So basically, using that for restrictive clauses and which for non-restrictive clauses just makes the whole thing easier for you, because you're like, oh, okay, I'll just use which with commas and that with no commas, and then boom, done. So I recommend doing it that way instead of just using which for both restrictive and non-restrictive, at least until you get comfortable with the concept of restrictive and non-restrictive clauses, and then you can use which if you want. But if you are going to use which anyway, just be careful, because if you put a comma before which, or set off a which clause with commas, that can affect the meaning of your sentence. So be careful about that. But I guess that's it for this class. I cannot think of anything else to teach you guys. So hopefully that helps you all clarify understand the difference between that and which. And oh, no problem. Let me just type this here. That is used only for restrictive clauses, which is used for either restrictive or non-restrictive clauses. It's conventional to use which for only non-restrictive clauses. Or actually, I should say only for. I need to be careful with how I place that adverb. Oh, no problem. I'm happy to help, Savion. Okay. No problem, Clara. The main ideas here today. Okay, so I'll just type that there for your convenience. So the main idea is here today. That is used only for restrictive clauses, which, oops, I messed that sentence up. Which, let me take that out. Okay, which can be used for either restrictive or non-restrictive clauses, and it's conventional to use which only for non-restrictive clauses. So 3 important ideas here today. Okay, I think that's it for this class. So if you all don't have any more questions, thank you all for I recorded this. So to those who are watching, thank you for watching. And to those who are here, thank you for being here. And I hope that this lesson helped you. So with that said, bye everyone. Bye. Bye.